Okay, welcome to this IUFRO webinar. My name is Mathieu Fortin. I'm a research scientist at the Canadian Forest Service and also a deputy coordinator of the IUFRO Working Party 4.1.7, which is called Tree Growth, Mortality, and Remote Sensing. This working party was created only a few months ago, and its objective is to foster the collaboration between the communities of growth and yield modelers and remote sensing scientists. So I invite you to visit the Working Party webpage on the IUFRO website for further information. So one of the first actions the Working Party has undertaken was to set up a series of webinars, the first of which is taking place today. And on behalf of the Working Party, I want to welcome Dr. Nicholas Coops, our speaker today. Nicholas is a professor at the University of British Columbia, a Canada Research Chair Tier 1 in remote sensing, and also the head of the Forest Resources Management Department. Nicholas leads the Integrated Remote Sensing Studio within the Faculty of Forestry at UBC. That is a research lab investigating and demonstrating applications of remote sensing data to conservation and forest production issues with doctoral and master's students as well as postdoctoral fellows. Nicholas's presentation will last about 45 minutes. So Nicholas, if you see me frantically moving my homemade red flag, it means that you have only 5 minutes left. Something really important, I ask all the participants to keep their microphones switched off during the presentation. When the presentation is over, we will stop the recording and there will be a period of questions. So without further ado, over to you, Nicholas. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everyone. And many thanks for taking the time to come and hear this presentation today. It's great that this working group's been set up, and it's a delight to be able to give a talk and start some conversation around what I think is a really interesting topic. So let me just share my screen. It says I can't. The host isn't allowed for sharing. So Matthew, can you just fix that?
I'll try.
I can see the button, but it gives me an error.
Okay. Sonia, I think if you could take the host and try to,
sure.
or to set Nicholas as a presenter.
Sure, a second. Hope it works now.
Yep, it's working. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Okay, can you see my presentation? Yes? Can people see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about this topic, advances in assessing tree growth and mortality using remote sensing. And I'd like to recognize that the work I'm talking about is certainly not all my own. And I want to recognize the work of Piotr Tempowski, who was in my lab for many years, but now at a Canadian Forest Service, Jose Roffrio, who is a postdoc within my research lab, as well as Tristan Goodbody, Lucas Jarin, and Spencer Dyken Cooper, who have also contributed to this work. Okay, so I really want to focus on how remote sensing can be used to go away and look at tree growth and mortality. And perhaps the most important remote sensing that's giving us guidance to that is LiDAR. LiDAR, also known as airborne laser scanning, is revolutionizing the way we measure our forests. And many of you on the call have heard about LiDAR and are probably using it in your research and your operational forestry today. LiDAR is a very simple technology. We beam the photons down to the surface, they return, and they give us the three-dimensional structure of the forest itself. The first graphic I had there was from NASA, demonstrating how it might work from a satellite. Here you can see, with an image from the University of Zurich, just how that data then can go away and derive these different products about the forest, all related to the structure. So LiDAR is proving to be a really revolutionary technology that we can go away and use. The last decade has seen a lot of development in LiDAR to give us information for inventory. We get our point clouds, as you can see here in the black and white graphic, giving us the three-dimensional information about the forest. From that, we can go and derive different metrics. For example, maximum cover, minimum cover, mean cover, different percentiles. And we build some sort of regression model, and this is called the area-based approach, to then go away and get our inventory attribute of interest, in this case, volume. I would argue that the development of inventory attributes from LiDAR is operational. We've got many best practice guides, many papers written about how to go away and do that, and we're seeing it used across the globe in this role. So we know that LiDAR is very useful for giving us the standard forest inventory attributes that we need to use for a forest. This can be volume, it could be height, it could be cover, it could be gross merchantable volume, it could be number of trees. LiDAR is successfully being used to give us these attributes. But to date, LiDAR has been often flown once. It costs quite a bit of money to get the airborne data, and so we have one snapshot of our forest. And so a lot of the reports that you've probably read, the work that you're doing, you're using one layer of airborne laser scanning data because it took you a lot of money to go away and get that layer. But now that LiDAR has become so established, we're now able to get multi-temporal LiDAR. And I think this is the game changer then in terms of the way we think about growth and mortality. Because we don't just rely now on a snapshot of one point in time. LiDAR data collected at 2 or 3 or 4 points in time is giving us the ability to assess change. And of course, in a forestry context, growth and mortality are key indicators of forest change. So this is why I think it's an important topic for us to discuss today, and why I think this working group is important. It's not that LiDAR is new in forestry, it's the fact that we now have access to these multi-temporal, often very large data sets of LiDAR over time, and that's what is more unusual. And how do we process that to go and give us these aspects of forest change, for example, growth and mortality? So let me start perhaps with the easier of the one, and I'll talk to you why I think it's easier as I go. But there's the idea, can we use LiDAR data over time to measure growth? Well, yes, we can, and it is conceptually very simple for us to understand that. These are great slides by Piotr Tempowski to explain the approaches that we might use to do so. We have LiDAR data at time 1. We have LiDAR data at time 2. You, I, and the 100 people on this call would agree that if that's changed, there's some growth. So we can try to get growth, but how do we get growth from those 2 LiDAR time steps? There's 2 ways we can think about it. I could build a model, just like I built the model in the first few slides. I could build a model of height, I could build a model of basal area, and I could build a model of volume using the time 1 LiDAR. And then I could go and build a second model of height, and a second model of basal area, and a second model of volume using the time 2 LiDAR. And I could subtract those 2 modeled attributes. That would give me change. And if that was positive, it would give me growth. So that's one way we can think about getting LiDAR data and change. And it's perhaps the most logical way to go away and do that. There is another way we can do it, which is slightly more complicated, where we actually look at the point clouds. If I look at the point 1 point cloud, and I look at the point 2 point cloud, I could actually go away and measure the differences in the point cloud. And then I could relate the difference in the point cloud to the difference in growth, different in those attributes of the forest and growth. So in one approach, I'm building models and subtracting the models. In the other approach, I'm comparing the point clouds directly, getting the change in the point cloud and relating that to the change in height or the change in volume or the change in cover. So these are 2 ways we can think about getting growth from LiDAR data, and we've in fact called the modeling-based approach, where you need to go away and build a model each time, as the indirect approach. Whereas if you're directly trying to compare the change in the point cloud, it's the direct approach. So there's two general ways we can try to think about how we might try to pull growth from two LiDAR point clouds over time. Here's just an example of that, applied in a Chinese fir forest in China. Tropical environment, trees grow very well. We're trying to go away and look at biomass. And this is the work of Lin Cao at Nanjing Forestry University. So he's gone away and he predicts biomass at time 1 in 2007, biomass at time 2 in 2013, and then subtracts them. And he, of course, finds that there is a shift in the predicted biomass of that forest over time. Start thinking, though, about that change period. We can see here he's comparing the biomass change from 2007 to 2013. So what's that? 7 years. So that's 7 years of change in biomass. Now, in a tropical forest that's very happy and growing very well, there might be quite big changes in biomass over that period of time. So in that case, the change in biomass might be quite accurate. But for those of us who live in areas with much more slow-growing forest, for example, in the boreal forests of Canada, the boreal forests of Europe, these forests are growing much slower. So if you go away and think about a 7-year increment of growth, that might be quite small in a boreal forest. So our ability to extract that growth signal from the LiDAR data is dependent on a few things. It's dependent on how fast the forest is growing. Are we only measuring a small amount of difference, or are we measuring a big difference? And of course, it depends on how long is that time period between our LiDAR. LiDAR's only been around 15 years, maybe 20 years. So it's very unlikely we're ever going to see a paper coming out, here's 40 years of change with LiDAR. We don't have LiDAR for 40 years. So we're a bit trapped in terms of the accuracy and our ability to go away and get these growth metrics with LiDAR data when we look at a time series, if our time series is quite small and the growth of the trees is quite short. So when you think about using LiDAR for growth, it is going to depend on the environment you're in, how much LiDAR data you have, when it was collected. And just to point to these graphs here, again, a demonstration by Piotr that it can get really, really, really tough to predict height increment and volume increment in stands that are growing very, very slowly. And this being a boreal forest example in northern Alberta. Generally, we would expect height to be best. LiDAR measures height. So change in height is going to be the best variable. Change in biomass, change in volume, change in number of stems, change in basal area is going to be tougher. Expect to see changes in height be the best result, as you can see it here, but it still can be challenging. So you conceptually think to yourself, yes, it's easy to get change with LiDAR. It isn't necessarily easy. And that's why we do have active research and people working in this area. Piotr did a review and came back and made the conclusion, generally in his work and the work of others, is that the direct approach is better, but there is no general consensus. There is no general methodology we can go away and use because lots of people are working in different areas with different data to go away and assess that. Change in height is always going to be better, but this increment time is also something we need to think about, and the growth of the forest needs to exceed the uncertainty in the LiDAR. LiDAR is not error-free. There's error in time 1 and there's error in time 2. So you need to think about your error budgets from the LiDAR data and then think about how is that going to impact my ability to assess the height increment that I want to go away and see. So that's thinking about growth as comparing one point cloud to another. Something else we often want to do when we think about doing growth is linking growth to a growth and yield model. For example, a stand yield curve, a growth curve like this. Some sort of attribute of variable of interest like height or volume on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. You've gone away. You've spent thousands and thousands of dollars building this LiDAR layer of height and this LiDAR layer of volume and this LiDAR layer of biomass, how might you link that layer to your standard growth curve that you have? We've been trying to play with how you link growth models with LiDAR for about a decade now in Canada. And there are a number of different ways and strategies that you can do to try to bring together the spatial benefit of the LiDAR coverage with the temporal modeling of something like a growth curve. I'm just going to describe one of those here. And the model that we've been using is a model based in Alberta called the Growth and Yield Projection System. It's pretty standard. It's a stand-based model. You have inputs of species, age, and it will go away and grow that model and grow that species forward in time. What's interesting here is how we can try to link the LiDAR attributes we have with the growth attributes that we want. We know LiDAR can give us height. We know LiDAR can give us basal area. We know LiDAR can give us volume. We know LiDAR can also, to some extent, give us stocking. Things that LiDAR can't give us very easily are species. We know it's very difficult to get age from any type of remote sensing data. So there are some attributes that we can get and easily apply and link across these models. And some attributes that are hard to get from LiDAR and we need to go away and get from somewhere else. For example, an existing inventory. So here might be the example of what we would like to get from running the model. We have a layer of height from LiDAR. We want to project that into the future. We want to project basal area. We want to project volume. We might want to go away and project the number of stems. And from that, we can go away and work out our current and mean annual increments. Piotr developed this system to go away and propose how we might go away and do that. And it is a complicated figure to explain. But really, what it shows is, on the top right, is the different LiDAR attributes that we have. We have LiDAR height. We have LiDAR quadratic mean diameter. We have LiDAR volume. We have information from our inventory on age and species. In this approach that Piotr proposed, and we've been using in different locations across Canada, is this idea of building a template library. You go and project all the different curves you can for all the different species combinations that occur, for all the different site index classes, for all the different ages. And you build this library of curves. These curves would be a volume library, a height library, a basal area library, a quadratic mean diameter library. What you then do is you try to work out for every single pixel in your LiDAR prediction, what is my current height? What is my current quadratic mean diameter? What is my current volume? And by telling us what they currently are and what we think the age is, we can position ourselves on the curve. And so we can assign every single pixel from the LiDAR predictions to an individual growth curve, which would then allow us to go away and predict all of these attributes forward and backwards in time. And you get a magnificent, spectacular, wonderful looking GIF like this. This is 4 attributes: height, basal area, volume, and number of stems. This is an area in Alberta. Each cell is 20 meters by 20 meters. On top of it, you can see the standard polygons that foresters use when they delineate the inventory using aerial photography. What you're seeing here is every single 20-meter cell, which has a LiDAR attribute of height, basal area, volume, and number of stems, is now being projected forward along a growth curve. And you can actually see the red pixel in the center, and it's tracking on that graph in the lower ones of each of the graphs. So what's happening here is by matching each individual pixel to a particular growth curve, we then can roll the model backwards and forwards and make these predictions across the landscape. And the benefit here, well, there's a number of benefits. One is it's 20 meters compared to these very large polygons. And you can see within the polygons, there's massive variability that a forester would previously have not had access to that we can now see from the LiDAR data. And here you can see about even more stark detail. If you simply went away and averaged the prediction in the volume-based inventory on the left, look at the additional detail that you pick up on the right by using the benefit of LiDAR data and all that spatial detail. But of course, the other benefit here is we can start to model the uncertainty. We can know what growth curve we're on, and we can estimate how likely is it that we're on the right growth curve. So we actually have an idea of the uncertainty of our prediction. So not only are we linking to a growth model, linking to a growth curve, but we can do that at 20 meters or 10 meters if you wanted. We can run it forward in time. What's our projected volume at 200? What was our projected volume at 10? But also we have this uncertainty estimate that we can extract as well. So I think we're making good progress on LiDAR data and growth. I think there are a large number of groups looking at this across Canada and globally. And I think we've got some good ideas about how to do it. I think there's some good review papers out there. I think there's a lot of people thinking about this now. And so I'm really excited by where this is going. 5 years ago, perhaps we were less sure about how to go away and do this. But I think we've got models of indirect and direct. We've got ways of linking it to growth models, and this is just one example. But I think we're really making progress on growth. But here's the kicker. The ability to go away and make these estimates around growth and make these estimates around how our forest is changing is highly linked to how much mortality is happening in the stand. And this is again a final summary slide from Piotr, where he went away and he looked at all these different studies that had their R-squareds and their model accuracies for their forestry attributes. And you can see here, this is a bit of a summary of the error, which is increasing on the Y, against mortality on the X. And this is for height and volume. We need to understand mortality to ensure our growth models are accurate. So I can sit here and tell you we're making good progress with LiDAR and growth, but if this stand is experiencing significant mortality, it's getting tougher to do that accurately. So we need to think about how we might go away and also use LiDAR data for mortality. We need it for its own sake, but we also need it to fully address these questions around growth. So, part 2 of my talk. How do we use LiDAR data to get mortality? It is tough. And I would argue that this is where the research is now at. This is what we're at a community, starting to think more around this topic. Growth is being well looked after, but if you're a PhD student trying to find a topic, want to work on LiDAR, pick mortality. It's the area where I think a lot of work needs to happen. So, tree mortality, most of you are foresters in the call, most of you are going to understand mechanisms that can cause and drive mortality, competition, issues around resource allocation, species relationships, disturbances that happen across the landscape. And of course, when we have models of mortality, we can then try to see that effect of mortality in a wide variety of forestry attributes: productivity, the diversity, the species mixes, the structures, and where we are in successional pathway. So LiDAR can give me the forestry attributes, but can LiDAR give me variables that become meaningful to understand mortality and succession in a stand? That becomes the question. So this work is from Jose, who's a postdoc in my lab. Jose's published on this work, and I've got his paper about it at the end. So I'm going to summarize his work, and I thank him for these slides. So you can think about it perhaps the way I'm going to present this in a couple of ways. We've obviously got our plot databases, our field measurements that are giving us our mortality. And obviously they're the most accurate of the ways we can go away and think about mortality. We obviously have airborne LiDAR data that I'm going to try to convince you is very useful. I'm also going to come back towards the end of this and also talk about how other remote sensing data can help as well, perhaps to see when we have mortality, what is actually happening to the forest itself. So we can see the mortality from our plots. And the work I'm going to present here is another boreal forest, but this is in Romeo Millet, which is a large, about 800,000 hectare forest we have in Ontario. Lots of plots, lots of measurements of mortality over time. And you can see these spectacular graphs that Jose spends the vast majority of his time working on, which are simply cleaning the data to go away and work out the first and last measurement, how many remeasurements we have over the history of the plots in that forest. We have LiDAR data. I'm going to touch on the attributes that we can use from LiDAR data to give us this information that might help us understand mortality. Then I'm going to touch on also, as I mentioned, using remote sensing to go and give us more information about things like species. So we've got this forest, we've got lots of plots, we've got lots of mortality. We've got methods to go away and summarize that mortality. And it's relatively easy to use that plot data to go away and work out our annual mortality rate. So this is just a function well established in forestry that allows us to establish what is our mortality rate based on measurements at time 1 and time 2 from plots. And you can see here, Jose's done that for 90, almost 90 plots across the Romeo, 5 different forest types. The measurements are ranging from 2004 to 2020. So here you can see the forest types in colours. There's all the plots, and each of those plots would now have an estimate of mortality. Now, I am not a biometrician, but Jose, who is, will tell us that there are lots of zeros in data sets around mortality, and so we do need to be careful as we go away and model that. And here he's proposing we would go and use a pretty well-established zero-inflated beta regression approach in order to model the zeros first, model those separately, and then once you've separated out the zeros, you can then use a beta regression to go and predict your mortality rate from anything above 0 through to 1. So what are we trying to do here? Well, we've got a mortality rate from our plots. The question becomes, how do we then relate that to, for example, LiDAR? So he thinks of this as being some sort of function where the mortality becomes a function of the LiDAR data with some other attributes as well, which may not come from LiDAR. And here he's actually using a couple of other variables, forest type and age. We know we can get basic height variability, cover and structure from LiDAR, but what else can we get? So perhaps the most meaningful LiDAR attribute that we can derive that is going to be related to mortality is gaps. Gaps is something that LiDAR is actually very, very well suited to predicting. A glorious infographic from Tristan Goodbody, a strip of LiDAR data. Here you can see all the gaps that he's finding within the forest, which are orange. It's not quite as easy as it sounds because obviously there are natural open areas in forest which may not be a gap. You've got open areas above water. You've got open areas like clear cuts. So you've got to go away and have definitions about how open is open and when is a gap a gap. But if you do go away and make those definitions, there's a pretty well-established approach to go and map gaps. And in fact, there's R packages to match gaps from LiDAR, including a lot out of the University of Florida. If you do know where the gaps are, you can then model the gap size frequency distribution. And that's what all those little funny graphs are at the bottom there. And in fact, there's work going on globally about demonstrating gap sizes change across different forest types and across different disturbance regimes. LiDAR is good at that. So what Jose did is he went away and predicted these LiDAR metrics like height and cover. He predicted the gaps, and then he used those variables in a model to go away and predict the mortality. And you can see the model was reasonably accurate at predicting the mortality rate based on those attributes. And of course, he had two models because he had the zero part of the model and then he had the beta regression. Not necessarily each model pooled in different LiDAR attributes. In some cases, they were different. But in general, the ability to predict it was relatively strong. And here you can see the partial dependence plots of the different attributes that then drive that model of mortality. So LiDAR data is giving us height. LiDAR data is giving us the distribution of the vertical height. LiDAR data is giving us the gaps. And then he's using age from the inventory and forest type from the inventory. And you can see the trends then in how much mortality we would expect, driven by principally LiDAR data. Once you've got the model, you then run the model everywhere using the wall-to-wall LiDAR, and you can make a map. So here is the Romeo with predicted mortality. So can we do it? Yes. Is LiDAR going to give us all of the data we need to do it? Probably not. It will give us a lot of it. And it will give us some pretty key indicators. Gaps, height, distribution of the vertical foliage being very important. And here Jose talks about that in more detail. Okay, so we can get mortality, certainly at a plot scale. It requires some significant modeling. You need some biometrician input. There's probably different components to the model because you got zero mortality and then you have a continuous attribute. But it is possible to do. And I think there's evidence that LiDAR can tell us that. It is going to be linked to things like gaps, however. I did promise to talk about something else besides LiDAR. So a logical next cool question to ask would be, if the stand has all this mortality, are we seeing a species shift? This is tough because remote sensing's only been up here for 30 years, 40 years. Species shifts may have been happening 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. So seeing successional changes, seeing species changes in stands is a little bit longer than our remote sensing records, certainly longer than our LiDAR record. Doesn't stop us from asking the question though. So here are some spectacular species layers we now have available in Canada, 30-meter Landsat derived for the leading tree, important tree species across Canada. This is available annually. So we have annual 30-meter wall-to-wall Canada-wide maps of species. And many jurisdictions around the world have similar things. I have, from that, a prediction in every 30-meter cell of what species it is. And I've got that over time. So if I've got species at time 1, and I've got species at time 2, and the species have changed, is that because of mortality? Cool question to ask, which is what Jose did. Getting into some pretty complicated biometrician graphs from Jose here, but if you think about the Romeo, there's these different forest types. They're listed as SFUs on the right-hand side there. This shows you, for all the different polygons in the Romeo, how species have changed over the time period of the record that we were looking at, which was about 2004 to 2022, about 20 years. So you can see here the proportions of polygons that change species. So if I just focus on the top left one to quickly show you what's going on, BW is birch poplar. And we can see here that about, 38 plots or stands stayed the same. But 60 plots over that time period actually changed. Their forest grouping, based on the Landsat prediction of species, was BW at time 1, but actually changed to MH2 at time 2, mixed hardwoods. So you can sort of see there is evidence, even in Landsat, that we're seeing species changing across the landscape. In some types of species mixes, it's very stable and doesn't change. For example, MC2, a lot of stands stay MC2. But you can see here that there's obviously some species mixing going on over time from the species record. So can I take that? Do these different species composition changes relate to the mortality work that is just done when it's predicted mortality and the LiDAR metrics that we have? And what he found is yes. It's not a massive signal, It's not a massive prediction of gotcha. Yes, I know that mortality caused this species change. But you can see here that the models are explaining over 50% of these species transitions. And this is just variable importance. So there's the different species groups in the Romeo, and the y-axis just telling you what variables are important. You can see the most important variable to explain the species changes that we saw is stand age. And that did not come from LiDAR, that came from the inventory. But the remaining three did come from LiDAR: stand height, gaps, and mortality, which was the mortality layer that he predicted. So for some species transitions, LiDAR is a very useful predictor to tell us that the species has changed the function of mortality. In other cases, age starts to become really important. And it does beg the question, let's keep trying to get accurate estimates of age from LiDAR to inform these types of predictions. You can also do partial dependence plots on this type of work. So again, there's the variables on the x-axis, the probability of a mortality transition on the y, and then the different species groups and what they change to. It's getting pretty tricky, but the thing that excites Jose is there are some clear tipping points. At a certain point of gaps, at a certain height, in certain soil types, we're much more likely to see particular species changes. So maybe it's not a predictive model in an annual year-by-year sense, but maybe there's some tipping points here that become useful to think about as we manage our forests. And of course, we can make a map. So there's our units, our area and our units on the left-hand side, the polygons, and then the species of what it was in 2005, and then the species 2018, and then the probability of that change occurring in the large graph. Pretty cool stuff. So if we're accurately able to get mortality, there's really interesting questions we can start to ask. And perhaps the other question I haven't got any slides on is disturbance. What about this link then between, yes, we know the insects are here, yes, we know the bark beetle is here, yes, we have non-stand replacing fire, yes, we have all these different things going on. Now we can try to see those by mapping the mortality and making that link. So I've shown you a species link. I'm sure many of you could think of other links between the mortality we have and these disturbances occurring in our forests. So mortality, can we get it? Yes. How are we going to get it from LiDAR? Yes. LiDAR gives us the structure. Gaps is critically important, but also height and vertical distribution. It allows us to go and make, for the first time, wall-to-wall maps of mortality. This is extraordinary, that we can actually go away and map the mortality of our forests at this very fine pixel scale, 10 meters, 20 meters, wall-to-wall. And I think it's going to ask many additional questions we can then go away and pose. I want to wrap up by perhaps talking about a few other things just to get your mind thinking about what I think about when I think about mortality. So I don't just think about standing trees dying in the stand. I think the other thing that we care about a lot in British Columbia, and I think a lot of us globally, is really this idea of the dead wood that comes as a result of mortality. And perhaps the really cool thing that we can do with LiDAR, not just aeroplane, now we could be talking about drone, ground-based LiDAR, would be really this mapping of the dead wood. There's a lot of interest in mapping dead wood on the forest floor and dead wood in streams and rivers. These are really important. They contain a lot of carbon. They're critical for biodiversity. They're important in streams to go away and build habitat. So wood in the forest on the floor has all these positive benefits. But wood on the floor also has negative benefits. Not a negative benefit, can also be negative. For example, fire. Lots of wood on the floor, on the forest floor, could be a problem for fire. So there's a driving imperative to map wood on the ground, wood in streams. Wood in streams, individually, or groups of wood, I realize not all of you are in forests like this, but we're blessed to have forests like this in British Columbia. Huge trees, huge dead wood. But here you can see how critically important that would be for things like stream habitat. Can we get this from LiDAR? Well, I can send a student in to go and measure it. It's probably the most miserable field work in the world. The student has to go away and put in waders, carry this expensive equipment I give them, and they can't fall over and get it wet. Then we make them walk the center of the stream, mapping all the wood as they go. It's pretty rough work. But from that, if I've got enough graduate students willing to do it, I can make some really good maps of where the wood in the stream is. Can I get that from LiDAR? We think we can, even from airborne LiDAR. So here's the airborne LiDAR, here's a forest stand. What we do is remove all the trees from the LiDAR data and only look at what's happening below 2 meters. Look at all the hits below 2 meters. We also know that the response of the LiDAR as it comes back will be very strong when it hits this wood. It's not like hitting a bush or a shrub where only a little bit comes back. We know when the pulse comes down and hits the wood, it's a strong return. So I can filter how much I have low in the canopy by this strong return and remove anything that I'm pretty sure is ground. So this gives me solid objects that are above the ground but less than 2 meters high. I can then some sort of cleaning up with buffering, and then I can apply a skeleton and I can join those together. And I can make assumptions around the fact that wood is normally straight or pretty straight. So I can go away and map these sort of small linear features from these point cloud bubbles that I'm getting on the surface of the ground. I can do that on land. I can do it across a stream. And I can go away and make a map of where I believe all the wood is lying across the stream as detected from LiDAR. Here's my stream. I've got my dots represent where my poor graduate students mapped the wood in the stream. The red is where I say it is. And you can sort of see within a GPS error, which is getting tough here, which ones we think we got and which ones we thought we missed. Some more data to that on the left-hand side. One log by itself is tough. A whole series of logs, I can get it. If it's lying across the stream, it's easy to find. If it's lying parallel to the stream, it's tougher. And I can also do this on the forest floor. A bit easier for the graduate student, but now make them map all the coarse woody debris. So here they're going out, they put a grid down in the plot, they go away and map each log that they go away and see. Similar approach. We take the LiDAR point cloud, we cut it off, we get rid of the trees, we remove the ground, we get rid of anything that's got a couple of returns like a shrub. So then we go away and see these big solid things that must be on the floor. We vectorize those or linearize those, and then we map them across a compartment, allowing us to go away and get both where we think every individual piece of wood is, as well as a spatial map of that or a density of that across the landscape. How good are we? We're pretty good. We're better than not knowing anything. Log jams, 80% we're good. Individual pieces, about 50%. Across the different watersheds we looked at on Vancouver Island, 63% overall. What impacted that in a river? Well, it depends where the log is. If the log's underwater, it's tough. If the log's parallel, it's tough. If you're looking at a side, it's difficult to do. In a forest environment, you need pretty good dense data, more than 7 points per meter, and the pieces of wood need to be fairly big, 30 centimeters. I'm not talking about twigs here. I'm talking about logs. And perhaps the last thing I just want to highlight, we've talked a bit about where drones might come in. Drones can give us LiDAR. We're collecting a lot of drone-based LiDAR these days. Drones can certainly see the wood in streams. Drones can certainly see the wood in the stems. But of course, the other thing we're seeing with drones in general is just the effect of disturbances. And this is the effect of fire, obviously massive amounts of mortality. We can go away and map, even from Landsat, what's alive and what's dead. But of course, drones is giving us this ability to map every tree. And we're actually moving towards models of individual tree mortality based from the fire. And this is actually some work done by Jeremy Arkin, my PhD student who's finished, but was mapping individual tree mortality due to scorch. So you've got all these spectacular trees across the landscape, you pull them out and you go away and try to look at canopy base height and then work out how much of that has been damaged. Scorch will ultimately lead to mortality. So let's wrap it up. LiDAR data is useful. We know it's important. We're using it operationally. We know it's very, very useful in that type of context. Traditionally, however, LiDAR data, we have one layer because it's been really expensive for us to go away and get it. Now we have lots more LiDAR data. Now we can see change. Now we have multiple LiDAR data sets through time, growth and mortality open up. We do know about growth. We've been working on that for the last 5 to 10 years. I think there's a really good sense of how to tackle that. There's some real issues around growth rates, length of time for LiDAR. Are you linking to a growth model? Are you doing it direct? Are you doing it indirect? But we've got ways to do it. Mortality is tougher. We're working on it now. Many of you should be working on it. I think it's a really exciting area to see this working group contribute to. Not all the data we need to predict mortality will come from LiDAR. There are going to have to be other data sets we bring in. But once we have these models, I think we can do extraordinary things. Look at species changes, look at disturbances. And then when we think about holistically mortality more broadly, what happens to those dead trees? There's some really cool stuff going on. Fine scale remote sensing to go away and do things like mapping the trees lying on the ground. Many thanks to Piotr and Jose, who did much of the work behind all of this, Tristan, Lucas, Spencer, and Jeremy for the last couple of slides. This work supported by the Canadian federal government, many forestry companies, and the large Silver 21 project I've been working on as well. Please email me, jump on our Blue Sky, talk to us, continue the conversation. Many thanks for spending the time with me today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. That was a great presentation with a lot of material. We will now stop the recording and move on to the question period.